Hello and welcome to the Schola Progenium. Today we will be talking about Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators. So I'll be splitting this into effectively two categories, which is what they can do effectively, in that what you should be asking them to achieve in your battles, and also how best to get them to achieve these goals. And I'll break those two categories down further as we go along. But first of all, just discuss Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators, or Termies as I will refer to them for the rest of the video. Why you should be taking them in their armies from a sort of fluff perspective. If you think about it, a Space Marine army, a Blood Angels army especially, is not complete without a unit of Terminators, in my opinion. They are just some of the archetypical units of the Space Marine fluff. You always see those Terminators going in. They're pictured in so much of the artwork. They're in so many of the video games, if that's sort of the kind of thing that you follow. They are just ultimate badasses, and obviously Terminators in general are ultimate badasses. Thunderhammer Termies are the ultimate badasses. In many ways, you could say that they are an essential Space Marine unit to have in your collection. If you collect Space Marines, if you collect Blood Angels, you really should have at least one unit of Termies in your collection, because no collection is complete without them. And they are really, really fun to build and paint as well. They're a really enjoyable unit to add to your collection. So if you're going to add them to your collection, which you probably should, you should know how to use them, because I feel like many people out there, they will have these Termies and they know they're good, but they use them for a couple of games and they're just not getting the kind of badass, destructive output that they expect from these Termies, and they think, well, they look good, they're cool, and they're alright, but they're not getting what I can get from other units, so I'll drop them, I'll leave them out, I'll get some Sign Guard or something like that. But today I'm here to tell you that, for me, Terminators are an absolutely auto-include for me. I very, very rarely take a list that doesn't have a unit of 5 Terminators with Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. If I'm really desperate for points, say I'm going for an Armoured Brigade or something like that, I may have one of them with what are they called, Lightning Claws, but generally, yeah, absolutely always go with these guys. So, what can they do effectively? Well, the most obvious thing is they can take on tanks and large armoured units. Thunderhammers, they put out 3 flat wounds a damage, 3 damage for every wound, so to speak, and that is just incredible. In 8th edition especially, with the amount of random damage weapons out there, I don't need to tell you that flat 3 damage for every wound that you put on a unit is just ridiculous. And when you're playing with Termies, because if you're a Blood Angel, because you get that bonus to wound, you will wound almost anything on 2s. Contemptor Dreadnoughts. The amount of times people have said, no, you wounded me on a 3, no, I'm wounding you on a 2, I'm a Blood Angel. Just absolutely ridiculous. So you're always getting those wounds through. They have what I call the push-pull effect Terminators, which is that when you drop them in to a vicinity on a battlefield, you will see that certain units will automatically be pulled in towards them, which can be very useful. So you might have units that are wanting to get into rapid fire range, so they'll run perhaps out of cover to try and get a good burst off at these Termies, because they're convinced they'll kill them off with enough firepower. Or you might get combat units, enemies counter assault units being drawn in to fight against your Termies, and they may be well capable of destroying your Termies, but that is a good thing, because essentially what you're doing is you're forcing the enemy to be reactive. And if they're taking these big assault units maybe out of a transport, deep striking them in as a counter assault, you know, moving them out of cover or from round behind cover or something like that, out of line of sight, to attack your Terminators. You know, they are exposing them, and your Termies are pulling them in and forcing them to react, so you're getting what you want, if that's the desired effect. You need to decide what you want to do with your Termies, and then place them very carefully so as to push and pull units. So you know certain units like vehicles will want to pull away, you know, push away from the Termies. They will push those armoured units away from them, and even though those are your targets, you know after your first charge armoured units are going to, you know, push away from the vicinity of the Terminators. You know, other units will be pulled in, units with good shooting that are going to rapid fire you, units that aren't too worried about the Termies, want to get them in close combat. So you need to decide where you place those Termies, what is going to happen in terms of the enemy unit movement, because there will be movement because of those Terminators, and you can see you can try and have the maximum effect, and the best way to learn that is through experience and trying different things, but you'll learn to maximize the effect of the push-pull effect of your Terminators on your enemy's placement of his units, forcing your opponent to play reactively, and that is one of the key parts of Terminators, forcing your opponent to be reactive. Now, another great thing about Terminators is they can distract from objectives. So if you place your Terminators targeting a sort of midfield area away from objectives, but you know you've got this push-pull effect, you can pull units away from defending objectives, and you can strike simultaneously with other assault units elsewhere on the board, something I'll discuss in a bit more detail later, in order to relieve the defences of an objective you want to take with other units. And so you're distracting your opponent from defending a certain objective because he wants to take care of the Terminator threat. He has to take care of the Terminator threat. If he doesn't, they will wreak havoc. He knows that, or she knows that, of course. Now, something else they can do, which is always something important to remember, it's something that I'm always reluctant to do, but it is very effective, and it's another sort of link into this push-pull effect, is you can use them in the later game when there's maybe only a couple of them left, and you've run out of command points, and you're really not going to get them into combat with anything they can be effective against, to sort of ward opponents off objectives. So if they're heading towards or sat on an objective, even though Terminators really shouldn't be holding objectives for you, if they are sat on an objective, it is unlikely the opponent is going to want to commit the firepower to remove those Termies from that objective if they're no longer coming towards him and you have other things that you're putting pressure on him with. And he won't want to go near those Termies in case they smash anything up, and anything really big he's going to need to use in his late game, and maybe doesn't want to commit to taking that objective right now. It just depends. They can be used, depending on where they are, to ward opponents away from objectives, push units away from sort of being tempted to take an objective off you. Now, sort of, if you were to wrap these sort of all these concepts up into two sort of large concepts, you would say that the sort of Termies have two essential psychological effects on the opponent. They put the voodoo in your opponent, which is a concept that, you know, is talked about by my brother quite a lot. It's something that me and my brother talk about all the time, and he has discussed it on his channel, so I'm sure some of you will be familiar with it. But basically, the voodoo effect is putting the psychological effect on your opponent, where he's sort of mentally a bit broken and mentally a bit sort of making the wrong decisions because they want to they want to stop things from unravelling, and the more they try and stop things from unravelling, the more they seem to unravel. And the Terminators are excellent for having that effect on your opponents and causing that psychological sort of defeat or panic, which cause them to make mistakes. And then the other thing is obviously that they are quite a red herring, so Terminators can be used to sort of assault an objective that in an area that you're not particularly bothered about holding, because 5 Terminators take a ridiculous amount of firepower, a real commitment of your opponent's resources to remove from the battlefield, from the tabletop. Which means that if you put them in an area and start attacking things that you want dead anyway, maybe support units or something like that, but you have no real intention of controlling that area of the board long term, you're going to be taking another objective elsewhere on the board, or committing to other objectives elsewhere on the board, your opponent will just not assume that is the case. They will not assume that. They will think, I've got to get rid of these termies are going to be coming at me. You can use them as a consistent threat, consistent pressure throughout the game, whilst really not actually having to spend too much time worrying about whether they even die or not. If they die, your opponent has committed a massive amount of firepower, a massive amount of resources, or a really good assault unit that's now going to have been beaten up quite badly in the process of killing the termies, and you haven't even been using those termies to try and take an objective or anything that you really want to do. All you want to do is draw their resources away from the areas that you actually want to control on the board. So that is really essentially what they can do effectively. They can delete big units, which is always nice. You send them in there and you make sure they delete a unit, and in deleting that unit you have a psychological effect on your opponent, and you acknowledge that psychological effect on your opponent and you use that to your advantage. If you're not using the psychological effect of Terminators on your opponent to the maximum advantage, then you're not going to get Terminators to perform to their maximum effectiveness. That psychological effect, obviously, in summary, allows you to pull units away from objectives, pull resources into combating the Terminators, and allows you to put a constant threat on the enemy and obviously keep destroying units. Now, how can we get the enemy to be so threatened by these Terminators? How can we have all of the above discussed effects of the Terminators play into our hands so easily? How can we absolutely guarantee these things? Well, first of all, let me go into that in a little more detail, because you have to guarantee that these things come off. Terminators are an expensive unit, and when you attack a unit, they have not many attacks. They'll have 11 attacks, including the sergeant between them, so they're not going to put out that much damage. So really, to make with such a high expense unit, that you really need to have a psychological effect on the opponent. You need to make sure that the first thing that they hit, they destroy. That has to be the case. The first target that they hit, they destroy. So you have to support the Terminators to make sure that you achieve this objective, therefore making the Terminators a unit that has to be dealt with and having all of the effects that we discussed earlier. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to decide how you're going to deliver your Terminators. Now, Terminators can be carried in a couple of units, a couple of transport units, namely the Land Raider and the Storm Raven. Now, the Land Raider is all well and good if you're going to use your Terminators as a counter-assault force. That is not what we're discussing today, because I personally believe that that is a waste of resources with assault Terminators. What we're going to be doing is, straight up, we're attacking the enemy, we are bringing the fight to the enemy, we are destroying the enemy's vital units, and we are forcing the enemy to react to our Terminators so that we can then achieve whatever objectives we want to do in the game. So, I would suggest either deep striking or delivery by Storm Raven. Now, you may say a Storm Raven is a large amount of points to invest in delivering one unit, but the Storm Raven brings so much firepower and is so resilient that it in itself will have the same effect as the Terminators. It will cause the enemy to, or your opponent, to pour so much fire into it and still achieve its objective of delivering those Terminators and getting off one killer round of shooting that will almost definitely destroy a tank, or at least a transport. which may sound like, oh, that's a lot of points to spend on, a very little, but that investment will pay dividends later on, because what the Storm Raven allows you to do is that it allows you to get your Terminators within 9 inches with a support character, and we'll go into that in more detail later, because you really, really want to take a chaplain with your Terminators. But what you do is you start off with your Storm Raven as close up to the enemy as possible. Now, yes, that's going to cause more incoming fire to your Storm Raven, but that's a good thing. You want the enemy to be shooting at your Storm Raven, because if he's shooting at your Storm Raven, he's not shooting at your Predators, your Razorbacks, your Rhinos, your Land Raider at the back. He's shooting at your Storm Raven, and his firepower is going to just be less effective fired at a Storm Raven, because every shot that he fires is going to be, or every unit that he fires at your Storm Raven is just going to be 17% less effective, because it's -1 to hit a Storm Raven because it's flying. So effectively, you have a cheat code where you have a unit that you can shove straight up in the enemy's face, right at the front of your deployment zone. The enemy is guaranteed to shoot at it, because you've got a load of Terminators in there and a chaplain, and possibly even a Dreadnought if you're that way inclined, and that is not a bad choice by any means. That is always a good idea. But so that is going to draw a lot of fire, and they probably won't shoot it down. Now, don't put it in the back corner, because if they do shoot it down, your Terminators are out of the game. They have a long slog, and they're just going to basically do nothing. If that happens, if the worst comes to the worst, any backline units that you have that Terminators can do the job of, i.e. defending an objective, you make the Terminators push up towards that objective, and you get that unit forward and into the game. But, let's say that doesn't happen. If they shoot the Storm Raven down, the Termies will be, a couple of turns away from an effective assault perhaps, but hopefully not. But ideally what you do is, you just drive the Storm Raven straight into the heart of the enemy. You pick a big unit like a Lehman Russ or a Land Raider, something that you want to destroy. You take on a Knight if you want, but you drive right up to it, to the Storm Raven, because then whatever happens to the Storm Raven at that point, you will have delivered those Terminators, and that is 50% of that Storm Raven's job. Ideally, the Storm Raven will survive another turn, and at that point it will almost definitely be ignored, because your Terminators are taking so much firepower at that point that the Storm Raven will survive into the late game. But if it gets shot down, those Terminators have to be, a 3-inch charge away, and with the Storm Raven flying right into the centre, and you having a 9-inch deployment from that Storm Raven with your Terminators, or, a 3-inch deployment and a 6-inch move or 5-inch move, you have the ability to place those Terminators within an absolutely guaranteed charge of any target of your choice, and that's the position you need to put yourself in, that guaranteed charge. Now, there is another way to get that guaranteed charge, almost, in effect, and that is to deep strike them in and use if you're a Blood Angel, the 2 command point 3d6 stratagem. And that is a viable tactic, and if you only have Terminators, the only assault units in your army, then that is a really valid thing to do. Don't bother with the Storm Raven if you're not going to use one already. Just deep strike them in. You've not got any other assault units. They're your assault unit. They're doing a specific little job of just wrecking one flank and drawing the enemy in or pushing the enemy away, and that's fine. Just use the 2 command points, 3d6 them in, get the job done. However, I personally feel that you need to have another assault unit. So what I will go on to now is the next sort of subtopic of how to use them effectively, and that is your support units. Now, I feel that a really solid extra additional assault unit to bring in at the same time as the Terminators is turn 2 Death Company Deep Strike 9 inches from the enemy with a 3d6 assault, because you are almost guaranteed to get in. Especially if you just have to commit a command point, but you will almost definitely get in always. And if you don't, that's just one of those things. Sometimes assault armies just fall flat on their face, and you just you roll with it, you'd learn from it, and you just play the rest of the game out to see what you can get from it. But what I feel is a really effective thing to do is to have the Terminators in a Storm Raven and have a unit of up to say even 12 Death Company with 2 Thunderhammers and 4 Power Swords, so a massive killer unit of Death Company. And what you do is you fly up first turn with your Storm Raven straight into the heart of the enemy, and then in this that absorbs a load of fire. Maybe it gets blown up and they fall into the enemy lines, and you use a command point to make sure they all stay alive. Maybe you'll have to re-roll a 1. Maybe it doesn't get blown up and it flies off and just is a support shooting unit for the rest of the game. Maybe they drop down in the second turn. At the same time, you simultaneously deep strike your other assault unit, and I'd recommend a big killer blob of Death Company in sort of whatever format you like, but I'd recommend bolters for the rapid fire spraying, and then a big chunk of chain swords, a big chunk of power swords or power axes, and because power axes, you know, mean you're almost definitely going to be wounding on 2s against almost anything, toughness 4 anyway. And a couple of Thunderhammers, because they're always useful to have with the Death Company. And what you do is use the 3d6 stratagem on the Death Company to get a guaranteed charge with the Death Company, and use the delivery system of the Storm Raven to get a guaranteed charge with your Thunderhammer Termies. And that way, the Thunderhammer Termies are having a massive effect on the game with the other assault unit, and that is going to help them survive into later turns, because you will have just targeted and destroyed 2 of the enemy's most important units with those units, because they can destroy most things that are dangerous to them. So you destroy a couple of units that are dangerous to them, maybe Exterminator Lehman Russes, you know, Land Raiders with just 4 Last Cannons, or Crusaders, or whatever you want. You know, there's loads of units that you can just drop down, 3d6 charge with 1 unit, Termies charge in from like a couple of inches away, wreck both those units, and you've got a lot less firepower coming in next turn. The other thing that you need is you'll need a little bit from your overall long range firepower in your army. You need to have an idea going into each turn of what firepower you're willing to commit to supporting the Terminator. So that may be a Razorback with twin Last Cannon. You think, I'm just going to pop that tank that's, you know, on a few wounds left, just to make sure that it doesn't give those Termies a hard time. I'm just going to pop that transport that can spray out fire. You may say, oh, I've got a couple of units of TAC Marines there, and they're just going to fire from long range, because they're not really doing that much anyway, they're only plinking away, but they're going to fire at that unit of TAC Marines that's got a plasma gun in it, just to help trim them down, and you're going to have an idea of what you're going to do as you go into the turn to shoot at enemy units that will, as a pure purpose, help support the Terminators. And you don't want to commit too much firepower to that, because you don't want to distract you don't want your Terminators to distract you from your objectives. Your Terminators are there to distract and affect the enemy, and you want to give them a little bit of support so that they can keep doing that effectively and don't take so much firepower that they become no longer a threat. But you don't want to commit too much firepower to supporting them, because then you're watering down your commitment to your own objectives, because those Terminators aren't trying to get an objective for you or complete an objective for you. They're just stopping the enemy from completing theirs, taking up their mental resources, taking up their resources on the battlefield, so you can commit more of your resources and get a better return on your resources at taking other objectives and destroying other units and doing other things on the battlefield. So, the only other thing that you want to do really to support the Terminators, you want to take a chaplain, but that is absolutely essential. I cannot underline enough, if you are going to take Thunderhammer Terminators, you have to take a chaplain. If you don't take a chaplain, just don't take them. It's that simple. They will not perform effectively and get you your points back and have enough of an effect on the battlefield to threaten the enemy if you don't have a chaplain. They'll be a bit dangerous, they'll look a bit dangerous, then they'll come in, they'll not do that much, the enemy won't be too worried about them, they'll think, oh, that wasn't so bad, and you'll be disappointed in them. You need to have a chaplain, because your Terminators are hitting on 4s with the -1 to hit with their Thunderhammers, but the Chaplain allows them to re-roll all the 1s and 2s. Sadly not the 3s, but all the 1s and 2s they can re-roll. And that means a fresh unit of Thunderhammer Terminators will usually get, give or take around 7, successful wounds on an enemy unit. After all said and done, re-rolls and all that. And that's just a rule of thumb in my eyes, personally. You can math hammer it all you want, but usually they get about 7 through. Now, 7 through, usually the enemy's getting either no saves or 6-up saves, commonly 6-up saves, because the AP -3 on most vehicles are 3-ups. Obviously you've got your Eldar vehicles that have infant saves and that kind of thing, but just, Eldar techno wizardry is just foul, and it's not something that we can really spend too much time worrying about. We have other ways to overcome that, like the glorious mighty assault cannon and the glorious mighty auto cannon, which I will discuss in other videos. But the Chaplain giving you those rerolls will just absolutely maximise the effectiveness of the Terminators. If you deep strike a Chaplain in, or you get a Chaplain in and he fails his charge and he wouldn't keep up with the Terminators and they wouldn't get their rerolls, and you have to leave a Terminator out of combat and only have 4 striking and 1 a bit further back 2 inches away in unit coherency, but to stay within the Chaplain bubble, then that is not a question, that is not a decision, you just do it. The rerolls come first. The rerolls give you more reliability. That extra Thunderhammer may seem nice. You may think, oh, I just need that extra bit of damage. But if you then roll terrible dice with those fewer guys, you will absolutely regret it. And having the rerolls just always makes up for a bad roll. I cannot underline it enough. It makes a good roll better, and it makes a bad roll potentially awesome still. It doesn't matter. So always take a Chaplain for those rerolls. So if you do those supporting things, and you give them a Chaplain, and you assault simultaneously with another unit to compound the threat, you will be using your Terminators effectively to have a push and pull effect on the enemy and allow you to achieve objectives with the other sort of 1500 points worth of units that you have on the field at the start of the game. Now, a quick caveat on command points. Now, command points are an essential part of effective Terminator use if you want them to go on into the long term, and you want them to carry on being effective and carry on being a threat. If you, out of your command point pool, one of the most effective things you can do is re-roll a 2+ save, and you'll be doing that quite a bit with your Terminators. But it is great for adding to the voodoo effect of Terminators, because there's nothing as infuriating to your opponent as them putting 12 wounds on your Terminators, you finally getting that 1 after about 9 dice, command pointing it, saving the last 3, having no damage, and he will be infuriated and he will start pouring more and more fire into those Terminators. So if the chance comes up and you fail and you have a command point spell, I would always save that first command point on your enemy. I would always save my command point in your enemy shooting phase to save a Terminator on a 2-up, because, or a 3-up if it's a plasma shot or something like that. Because if you can do that, that will increase the voodoo massively and just increase exponentially the effect the Terminators are having on the battlefield, which is what they're all about. Now, the other thing is a 3d6 charge is a really good stratagem to use with Terminators later on in the game. Now, earlier on in the game, as I said, unless they're the only unit that you're using for assault, in which case feel free to deep strike and use that 3d6, you should be delivering them effectively, I'd say, in a Storm Raven to get the most effect out of them. And I know that seems like a big investment, both monetarily and in points, but that really will make them very, very effective. And of course, if you have other assault units in Rhinos and that kind of thing, and you're going to bring in the Termies with other simultaneous threats, then that's absolutely fine. When I say the only assault unit, I mean the only sort of assault unit that is arriving suddenly and striking into the heart of the enemy like a deep striking unit. If you have Terminators and a Rhino with 2 units of 5 Assault Marines in, and you want to deep strike those Termies in, you know, yes, you have other assault units on the board. That's still a great idea. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you can deep strike another deadly unit in, like Unit of Death Company, like another unit of Terminators perhaps, that are going to use that 3d6 roll early on in the game, later on in the game, when say the Death Company are using their jetpacks to get around, or whatever you may be doing, your other assault units are jetting around in their transports, that's when you start using this 3d6, because that gets you a really nice charge, a comfortable, almost guaranteed 10-inch charge every time. You will get a 10-inch charge, which means that you've got a 15-inch guaranteed threat range as long as you've got the 2 command points to spend. So although it is a large investment, and in an elite heavy army where you may not have that many command points to burn, it may seem like a lot. That is, you know, top 3 stratagems for the Blood Angels. Top 2 stratagems for the Blood Angels is that 3d6 charge, because that allows your Terminators to really, they come across as a slow unit, and your opponent to think, oh, I'll move my tank 12 inches, or I'll move my tank 8 inches away and still stay in this little bit of cover here, because I don't want to get shot by his last cannons over there, but I still want to avoid the Termies. And then you've got a 15-inch threat range, so you move your 5 inches, but you get your 10-inch charge off and just wreck them. You know, that is, again, having a massive psychological effect, and it's giving your Terminators that mobility that they, you know, would otherwise lack. So, you know, when you can use that to get the Terminator to another portion of the board, and use an assault to, you know, get across the board and get those Terminators to stay in the action for longer, it's a really good investment of 2 command points. What I would say overall with command points is you have to be willing to commit some command points at least from your overall pool to the Terminators. If you've got Terminators in your army, you're going to spend at least a couple of command points in the course of a game on those Terminators, and you need to accept that. For them to be effective, they need to just get that one that comes up re-rolled so that they live just that little bit longer. You know, because that can be the difference between another squad shooting at them, not shooting a squad that you've got sat on an objective, or staying near those Termies, trying to deal with those Termies instead of moving off to take an objective on the other flank that you can move onto. You know, that you have dropped onto with some Assault Marines with jetpacks, or moved onto with a Rhino with some dudes in. You know, as long as those Termies are there, and you're committing just a couple of command points to keep them effective and keep them a viable threat, then the enemy is not doing what they need to do with their units to win the game. But you are doing what you need with your units to win the game, and you will win the game. So that you're always working behind the scenes of the Termies. That's the inherent value of the Terminators, is they have to be dealt with. And if you can keep them in the game for as long as possible, then the enemy has to deal with them, and you ultimately will get the most out of your Terminators and find them winning games for you consistently game after game. Thank you very much for your time. This has been the Schola Progenium. Goodbye.